Hey everyone, this is James here. I am going to be talking about another movie today that is notably not from Italy. So this might seem way off of out of left field, and perhaps it is. So feel free to comment below if you think it doesn't quite fit the channel. But I thought this would be kind of a fun one-off review that I'm going to do. If people really would like to see more, I'm happy to do more reviews of kind of like these crossovers. So why am I talking about this film? Long Arm of the Law, 1984. It's a Hong Kong film. So why about this, and why is this film, in my opinion, an ideal kind of crossover for Italian genre cinema fans, specifically fans of the Poliziotteschi Eurocrime film, into Hong Kong cinema? Well, in my opinion, there are kind of three main places that I kind of go to, three main countries outside of the U.S. that I will go to for kind of my genre, cult cinema films. Not to say that there aren't made by other countries, but I feel like these three film industries were really cranking out a high volume of films, a lot of them really interesting and some very, very good. And those places are Italy, of course, in Europe, and then Japan and Hong Kong in Asia. In many ways, the Japanese cinema mirrors a lot of the Italian one, where we have kind of this post-World War II prestige stuff. In Italy, it's kind of like the more neo-realist films. In Japan, you have people like Kurosawa, Ozu, Naruse, Mitsuguchi, so people like that that are kind of making these films for festival audiences. Obviously, that's not necessarily the target of this podcast. I like some of those films, but they're not necessarily what I'm the most passionate about. And then in the 70s, they had kind of this wave of grittier crime films, Yakuza in the case of the Japanese films. And I tend to prefer a little bit, but not that the Japanese weren't making interesting stuff, the Italian stuff over the Japanese stuff. Now, what's interesting is the Hong Kong stuff doesn't quite parallel those two film industries in the same way. In many ways, it peaked kind of a decade later. A lot of the stuff that they were doing in the 70s was more costume dramas, period pieces, things that, while I like quite a bit, don't necessarily cross over quite as easily into kind of the Poliziotteschi Eurocrime genre. So in the 80s, they started to make more contemporary set films. And I think this film, in my opinion, has a lot of the same positive attributes that the Eurocrime Poliziotteschi films do. So I think it, while maintaining also a lot of the Hong Konginess that would dominate a lot of the other films. So I think it's a really good one for people that are fans of Poliziotteschi, specifically like the really gritty Poliziotteschi, to move over to the Hong Kong film industry and check these out. I think a lot of people that like the Italian film industry would certainly enjoy a fair amount of Hong Kong films. In my opinion, this is like peak action filmmaking is like 1980s, early 1990s Hong Kong. Just some really, really incredible stuff going out there. And I love pretty much Italian cinema and Hong Kong cinema equally. Okay, so let's get into the quick synopsis here. It is an impoverished mainland Chinese gang sneaks across the border and begins to commit a series of crimes. Keeping it simple here. This has a reputation as being kind of one of the big films that came out in the 80s, very much a one-off, not necessarily as influential as it could be. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's one of those films that has shown up repeatedly pretty much from when it was created on like the best films of the 1980s from Hong Kong, the best Hong Kong films, period. And it's interesting because this is a very biting, a very gritty drama, the sort that you would not necessarily see made today when the Hong Kong film industry kind of has, a lot more restrictions placed on it. The sequels tend to blend in a lot more with what the Hong Kong film industry was up to at the time. But if you are familiar, or you may have seen some of the classics, things like A Better Tomorrow, Police Story, these two films came out within 2 years of this film, and they kind of showcase more of what Hong Kong cinema would create. Kind of your bullet ballets, John Woo, the stuff that would be really influential for Hollywood with A Better Tomorrow, and more of your martial arts, contemporary stuff like Jackie Chan with Police Story. This film, on the other hand, is more in the Eurocrime DNA. It's grittier. There's a lot of really, really great location shooting. It's very, very impactful. It's very brutal. It's extremely mean-spirited, and I say that in the best possible terms. And then more in the Hong Kongy terms, there are some crazy stunts. It feels very, very dangerous. So yes, should and why to watch this? Yes, you should. It's a really good film. A lot of overlap in terms of its appeal, but maintaining those characteristics. So this film, perhaps unsurprisingly, like a lot of Eurocrime, was taken and inspired by real-life events. In fact, it was written by an ex-cop. It's shot a lot on location. They even snuck a camera into mainland China and did some shooting there. It's also one of those films that's a crime film, but it's also a very political crime film too. So a lot of that reminds me a little bit of that southern-northern dynamic in Italy, where the southern is a little more impoverished. And here it's even more extreme, where we have China just recently kind of opening up. And so there are these gangs of people from China coming over to Hong Kong and committing a bunch of crimes and then trying to sneak back there. So it's very, very much of the time and place. And it's interesting to see because you really see that wealth disparity. It's taken place on Christmas. Hong Kong, very, very capitalist place, very consumer-oriented and stuff too. If you've ever been there, it's a lot of jewelry and things like that. So a lot of shopping that can be done. So that's really contrasted with these mainland criminals who would be seen by the locals of Hong Kong as very bumpkiny, even though they are probably born just a little bit over the border. So it's Cantonese speaking as well. And so it's like they are from a very similar geographically placed to Hong Kong, but because they're born on the other side of the border, it's completely different culturally. So that's interesting. There's a lot of political, social commentary built into the film. It's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need to know it in order to enjoy the film. I think the film's perfectly enjoyable as a crime film, but it does add a lot to the richness of the text, just like it does add to the richness of the text if you know a little bit about the background of the Years of Lead in Italy's case. So I'll just get into a little bit of it here. So the 4 criminals, there was 5 at one point that end up sneaking over. They were part of kind of this militant group called the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution of China, which means they actually did have real fighting experience, which is something that Philip Chan, the writer here, talks about a bit, about how these people were especially scary because not only were they coming over here heavily armed, but they had real combat experience and they were not afraid to use it. And so, yeah, this film basically takes that chaos and that action and those gunfights and things like that over across the border to Hong Kong, where we get this great location shooting. There's explosions and things like that. And one other interesting thing about this film, too, is it's directed by a guy named Johnny Mack, who only did 1 film. But it's also produced by Boho Films, which is none other than Sammo Hung's production company. So if you're not familiar, Sammo Hung is basically like the next famous person over from Jackie Chan, his big brother, hugely influential and had his hand in a lot of different films, but really more well known for kind of the more martial arts stuff. So things like police story style films or old school stuff. So this one is really kind of something new. And I think if it wasn't for things like A Better Tomorrow and Police Story that would come and were probably even bigger hits in Hong Kong at the time, I think maybe there would have been more films sort of like this. But there's this really kind of brief wave of these really impactful social commentary filled crime films. A lot of them centered around people from China coming over to the U.S., which is the entire Long Arm of the Law series. And so, yeah, they're very, very interesting. This film, like a lot of Hong Kong or even Japanese stuff too, has a lot of tonal whiplash if you're not used to it. For me, at least, I'm very used to it, so it doesn't bother me necessarily. But it's the sort of stuff that can go from a very dark, rapey scene into kind of like this whimsical music. There's a lot of cultural comedy built into it too. Let's see. One other place that this really feels to me a lot like an action noir. It's very noir-y in terms of like its characterizations of people. Everyone's very self-motivated. There's a lot of double-crossing, triple-crossing, things like that. And I think it's very, very legible for people from other, coming across from other cultures. You don't need to have seen 100 Hong Kong films to appreciate this. One place that this is really, really Hong Kong-y is the set pieces, and that's something that I think the Boho Films is bringing to it. They had a action choreographer that was from the Sammo Hung stunt team that did these. There are some really fantastic set pieces in this, and that's, I think, something that I really enjoy about this film too. The fact that it combines these like gritty, true-to-life crimes and this really, really hectic atmosphere with these just incredible, brutal stunt pieces that happen. There's a shootout at the skating rink where we have people falling from huge distance and just freaking out a ton of different consumers. There's an incredible shot with a helicopter, and I think perhaps most notably, the conclusion happens in an area known as the Kowloon Walled City, which is basically this really strange area within Hong Kong that it was considered part of mainland China. So it's a part where you would have these crazy structures that were really claustrophobic, really closely built together. And you would have people would go there, and there would be like underground dentists, things like that. So very, very black market type stuff. And so they end up hiding out there, and it's just like they are literally rats stuck in a cage as the heavily armed police try to take them out. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. I strongly, strongly recommend it based off that. Just some really, really great set pieces as well. So if you did watch this film and you did like it, I would say if you want to stick with kind of like the grittier style Hong Kong cinema, unfortunately there's not as much as there maybe could have been, but I would recommend Ringo Lam for those, specifically his earlier films. Stuff like City on Fire, School on Fire are really good. Or you can check out the more stylized stuff, so things like A Better Tomorrow or the martial arts things like Police Story. So those are pretty obvious recommendations if you are familiar with Hong Kong cinema. But again, this is an Italian film channel, so I'm targeting it towards people that may not have seen it. So I do, if you're someone that's really into Italian cinema and it feels like you've seen everything that's good, I strongly recommend people check out Hong Kong cinema. I think there's a lot there to offer too. Who won the film? Johnny Mak. So his background was kind of in more TV, used to filming with a lot of cameras, but this was a very personal project for him, and I think it comes together really, really well. Double feature, I would recommend something by perhaps Damiano Damiani. Let's see. How about Confessions of a Police Captain for something that's a little less hectic and kinetic? Those would be good words to describe kind of Hong Kong film, just the amount of motion and stuff there. But very cerebral, also has a lot to say. So Confessions of a Police Captain by Damiano Damiani. Gonna give this an 8.5 rating. Really solid film. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this review, if you found it to be way too off topic, or if you found it interesting. I will see y'all next time. Cheers.